So are most of you familiar with Beacon Press, or are some of you thinking, what's Beacon Press? I'll just say Beacon Press is a 160-year-old publishing house based here in Boston, and although we are not a scholarly press, we're a crossover press. We do trade books, but many of them by scholars. So that's how we kind of qualify in this world. But what I'm talking about really, I hope, applies to any publishing house. And diversity has been on our minds for a very long time. I came to Beacon in 1995 as the director. And one of the first things I noticed was that we had a majority of women on our staff, in fact, an overwhelming majority of women. And we also had a very strong representation of LGBT people. I should say LGB. We didn't have then any trans people on staff, but we didn't have any racial diversity at all. So I knew that we needed to start working on this, and I was very lucky to have some colleagues on staff. One in particular I brought from my days at FSG, Tom Halleck, as Director of Sales and Marketing and later Associate Publisher. And he's been a great ally in this work. And then later, Gayatri Patnaik, who came on, is now our Editorial Director. And she has been a huge ally as well. So I guess first and foremost, I would say it's a team effort. And in fact, first, second, third, maybe last, you need a team to make this happen. The thing we fail to do, but which I would really recommend to anyone trying to take leadership in racial and ethnic diversity, is to first get a deeper understanding of the culture of white supremacy. I think it's an essential first step, even though we didn't make it. We're now playing catch up on that. In fact, we're having on Monday an all-day, all-staff retreat to talk about the cultures of white supremacy and race and class discrimination. It took a while to get the staff comfortable with the idea that we are a white supremacist organization, not because our staff are white supremacists, but because it's baked into our culture and, in fact, into the culture of book publishing, perhaps as much as any industry, because of the tradition of low salaries, of hard work, of connections, of coming out of certain cultural backgrounds that qualify you to work in publishing. So all those things work to make book publishing particularly white. And of course, we all know all the stats on how white the publishing world is. So recognizing that and really avowing that dismantling that culture and building a diverse staff is existential. That is, we may think, oh, that would be a good thing to do, but it's not a good thing to do. It's essential. We have to do it. We cannot continue publishing in the 21st century without being much more diverse. And in fact, when we were talking, we're currently 30% people of color on our staff. That is, we have a staff of 31 and 10 are people of color. But we're aiming to go to 40%, and by the year 2042, the majority of this country will be people of color. So we will need to be at least there, if not beyond that, in order to be relevant, in order to be publishing the right books and the right authors and having the right cultural lens on the books that we are choosing and how we're editing them and how we're promoting them. All of those things really are about staying alive, and it has to be a team effort. I discovered that although we did start an internship for people of color in 1999, and we have been trying very hard to hire people of color ever since then, that it doesn't work until you make it absolutely intentional, until you say, we're not hiring anyone and we're not interviewing any candidates who are not people of color, because we are so white and we need so badly to be more diverse that we need to find candidates of color and hire those people. I think, we're protected on that because we're part of a religious organization, which is the Unitarian Universalist Association, and we can make decisions like that. But in one way or another, the whole staff has to be dedicated to this principle of creating diversity in your team and go after it in the most aggressive way that you possibly can. When you don't have candidates of color for a job, don't hire. Look further. Make more inroads. Do more outreach. There are people of color out there. It's just often a little harder to find them. You will have a staff member who says, oh, my best friend from graduate school is just finished her PhD and she wants to work in scholarly publishing. Can we interview her for this job? And you have to say, is she a person of color? And if your current staff member says, well, no, then you say, well, we'd really like to hire a person of color. This is going to be important because we don't have anyone of color in the editorial staff or on the business staff or whatever staff you're hiring for. So I think that's like a really, it's hard to do. I will confess it's hard because often my managers will say, I have a really great candidate. She's got a lot of training. She's done 2 internships. She went to the Columbia publishing course. She could hit the ground running. And I'll have to say, I think you need to look further, look deeper, find some candidates of color. And then, of course, you have to accept that it will take longer, often, to find good candidates of color, that the positions might have to go unfilled, or that you might have to fill them with temporary workers until you can identify some good candidates of color. You just have, that's part of the deal. Otherwise, you will constantly be filling those jobs with the bright, young, white people. That's just how it'll go. It's how it's gone for decades and decades in this industry, for centuries in this industry. You also have to realize that you're going to need to make hires outside of your normal channels, not the people who necessarily got their degree from Emerson in publishing or took the Columbia course or did the 3 internships with your colleagues at other houses who call you up and say, I've got a great person for that opening. You may have to just put all that aside and say, okay, we're really dedicated to diversifying our staff. We really need to diversify our staff. So let's look at some things that might be barriers to that. And one, of course, is salary levels. And if you can adjust your salary levels, you should. We did. It wasn't easy, but we did, and that was an important step. You also need to look at the list of requirements that you put down for a job. I think one of the reasons this industry is so white is that we have picked people to work here who came up the same way we did and who had the same kind of education we did and who maybe came from the same kind of households we did, households where publishing was considered glamorous. It was known that you could work in book publishing, and that was a great industry. And there were a lot of books in the house, and there were a lot of people talking about books, and then they went and got the right education in the right places. And those people are overwhelmingly white. And that's maybe not where you're going to do it. I'd like to quote, did any of you happen to hear Chris Jackson when he addressed? Yes. Okay, so bear with me. I want to quote a little bit of his remarkable speech about his own career in publishing. Do you all know that Chris Jackson is a Random House editor who now runs an imprint that is all about racial diversity? He famously edited both of Ta-Nehisi Coates' books and many other wonderful books. So Chris said, first, I was not, to put it lightly, qualified for the job in a technical sense. This is about his very first job in publishing. I was a recent high school graduate. I'd never worked in an office before. I didn't have a resume and didn't even know how to type a letter. I'd read deeply in certain areas, but in the style of an autodidact, not a credentialed scholar. But I was passionate about the work. I was willing to learn, and I became a huge asset to that strange company. It was a very small publishing house. Instead of a likely terrible security guard, which was another option for Chris at that point. Publishing, it turns out, is a job you can learn while doing, if people are willing to help a little. I was lucky to find my way into a publishing house that was not constrained by corporate hiring practices, so they could take a risk on someone like me. The job is not that complicated. You have to be able to read and write well, to think and communicate clearly. It takes 5 minutes to learn how to format a letter. It takes a week to learn the internal systems of a company. Every new hire, this is a lovely part of this, every new hire is a chance for me to learn something new in teaching them, to question something I thought I knew, to have my ideas challenged, to have my status quo in some way shifted. And in publishing, those opportunities are far more valuable than a pre-mastery of technical knowledge that can be learned on the job. And yet, the lack of credentials, connections, and certain forms of experience can sometimes bar people at the entry level. They never even get in the door. And I've had that experience myself with some of our hires, people who don't really know that much about book publishing and who didn't know how to get to the door, much less inside it, who didn't have the right resumes and who hadn't had the right connections, the people who would call me and say, you got to hire this person. So, you know, that what Chris is saying is take a chance, bring someone in, teach them. You will learn while teaching as well. But the stuff that we think is so important to know before you get to publishing, it can be learned. As long as there's the passion and the commitment and the basic drive to become a member of the publishing community, all the rest can be learned. And that brings me to another point of the hardness, which is that, of course, people would rather hire the person, the candidate who presents, having all this knowledge already packed up and to be able to hit the ground running. And once again, the temptation for a hiring manager to hire that candidate and not to have to train them, and not to have to go back and teach them, you know, what's a galley? You know, what do you mean by transmittal? You know, all these basic things that, yes, we don't have to teach people who've been to Emerson or Columbia or, you know, who grew up in a household where publishing was part of life. But it's so worth it, and it's, even though you will have to train more, you will have to dedicate more time to the training, it will, what that person brings you is so important and cannot be taught and cannot be learned. So you have to make that trade-off. It's hugely important to be open to do that. So what you're looking for now, instead of someone who has the right college degrees and, you know, the right internships or the right skills, you know, Microsoft Office Suite and Excel and, you know, the 5 other things you want to list. What you're looking for now are intelligent, motivated applicants with a drive to learn who offer you the enormous added benefits of their cultural experience and the cultural lens that they can put on the work you're doing. And now to part 2, although it'll be much shorter, is that you need to set up supports for your hires, for all hires, in fact. including perhaps individuals on staff to mentor the new hires. So we have a mentorship program so that everyone who comes into Beacon, on entry or just above entry level, is assigned a mentor who is not in their department, and they do not report to at all, but who can help them navigate the culture, deal with problems, be able to speak about issues that they're facing and concerns that they have. If you can form support groups, or if the people of color on your staff, like our people of color, are willing to form their own support groups, that's hugely helpful, because then they have a space, and you have to create a safe space, or as we now call it, a brave space for people to interact and talk through issues and questions. And if you can put a little budget on that, and let them at least order pizza, and maybe sometimes hire someone to do a training with them, that's also invaluable. You have to be conscious of making that space, and also making a larger space for the entire staff to have conversations about white supremacy, about institutionalized racism, about class as well. In fact, a lot of people on our staff, including most of our people of color, are very avid to talk about class. And so that becomes part of the conversation. And bringing in outside people to facilitate that conversation can be really helpful when you're doing that. That's what we're doing on Monday. With the full day with an outside consultant and pizza and salad. And we do have this kind of ongoing set of conversations. We have also another safe space, which is a monthly chill luncheon, where everybody on staff is invited to bring their lunch in and to sit and have a conversation. And every other month, the conversation is about diversity. So they can bring in articles that they've read, or, issues that they want to talk about. And very often, we end up talking about Trump instead. But, that's kind of compelling now, but it is good to have that space. And a last little thought is that, you definitely want to have a line on all of your job descriptions saying that you value a diverse workspace, and that people of color are strongly urged to apply. You could expand it and say people of difference. You could expand it to say, as we do sometimes, people of color, people from the LGBTQ community, and people with special needs are warmly encouraged to apply. But think about that, and think about putting something on your reviews. So whether you do semi-annual or annual reviews of staff, that there's a line in that review that invites them to talk about with their experiences with race and class in the workplace. So those are my thoughts, and as I say, I wish we had this all figured out, but we're proud to be on the road to trying to figure it out.